now I'm going to just look quickly at a bit of electronic placement. I've already covered assembling the centre section and the booms and the boom blocks. We've still got our little single screws in, just holding those in place. I've got my pivot boom here, and I've got my shortened motor wires all sitting in the centre here. So the next thing I'm going to do with this is add some ESCs. And what I like to do with the ESCs is sometimes I shorten these leads up. Depends on how much of a rush I'm in with the build. But what I like to do is get a little bit of my double-sided tape I mentioned in the first video, and just cut off a little section, attach that to the label side of the ESC, and I'm going to then stick this in place. And what I try and do is get the ESCs nice and close to the mounts. Now, normally on a tricopter or some of the bigger airframes, we have a Voltaire power distribution board sitting in the centre here. So I tend to mount the ESCs like in the gaps around the motors and stuff like that. But I've got plenty of room because of the way I'm doing this build. So I'm just going to start with one ESC there. And I will actually just plug the motor wires into that. 2 and 3. I've done another video on how to check that the motor directions are correct, and I've done another video on programming up the ESCs previously, so if you want to look at how to set motor directions and configure the ESCs, you can check that video. So I'll now move on to my next ESC, and I'll place that somewhat symmetrically. I find if you try and keep symmetrical, it just makes it all that much easier as far as CFG and balance and stuff like that goes. So I'm going to pop that one over there and connect U3 to U3. Now, one thing I like to do after I've done the motor directions and got all this wiring sort of sussed out a bit, what I do is I actually take these apart, the actual motor leads, and then what I'll do is I will put a bit of heat shrink over that connection, so there's no way in the world that's going to come out in flight. It's actually got heat shrink tubing holding the whole thing in place. Now, at the moment I'm starting to end up with a bit of a mess here wiring wise, so my other old favourite, the cable ties, start coming into play. The thing I find with any sort of RC build, it's a habit I picked up from helicopters because there's lots of wiring going everywhere in those, is if you can keep the wiring neat, generally you end up with not only something that's easier to fix, but generally it's more reliable. I know it sounds crazy, it doesn't seem to make sense, but yes, if you can keep the wiring neat, it makes the aircraft more reliable. Okay, trim them off, and I've got one more from a rear motor. I'll stick him in the centre. Actually, I won't stick him in the centre because the battery strap sits over that section. So what I will do is I'm going to put this ESC just down here beside the pivot mount. Now the servo is going to end up on this side, double-sided tape, so I'm going to pop him in there. I'm going to have a servo sitting here, so I'm going to plug these wires in here, 2 and 3. Now at this stage I would grab my servo tester and a battery, and I would actually power each of these up individually and check the motor directions. The other thing I would normally do at this stage is double check using the programming card the programming of the ESCs. but I've covered that in other videos previously, so if you want to check on that side of things, go look for those videos. Now I've got these two sitting here next to each other, so I'll just grab another cable tie and do that just to hold them together. Now I have here the 3 power input leads for the ESCs. They will plug into the loom that is supplied with your heli. I'm not going to use one in the end on this, I'm going to do something different, but for now those 3 would plug into your loom, which would lead out typically on this side of the airframe to the LiPo. Alright, but for now I'm just going to sit you guys in the centre, and that leaves me with 3 ESC leads. Now I know these 3 are going to end up being, see why neatness counts, I know these 3 are going to end up being sitting somewhere about there, together with the servo off the tricopter gimbal coming up through the top hole in the top frame about there. So again, you can see how I end up going through so many cable ties. Chuck another one on there, even if it's just temporary, just to hold those 3 so they're at about the right length, and trim that off. Now you can see that doing the S-bends inside the arms has meant there's a lot less cabling sitting in the centre there. Now on this I've got lots of room, but if this was a Vampire or an Octo or an X8 or even a Y6, there's going to be a hell of a lot more electronics sitting in there. I've still got all this room up front for the gimbal to pop into, so that's all pretty cool just there. Now, just for the sake of my own sanity, I'm just going to chuck a cable tie on those connectors for now, just to keep them out of the way. I should have bought shares in a cable tie company. I'd be rich just on my own usage by now. And that's basically all the wiring sitting in there that I want to do for the moment. So at this point in time, I can sit my top plate over the top. Okay. And then I use the 10mm screws to screw the top plate down. Now some of the instructions say don't use your Loctite. I keep mentioning it, it's really important stuff. Don't use the Loctite on these top screws, but I say to do so. Now, just as a point, because this seems to be confusing a few guys, we used the little screws, the 5mm ones on the bottom plate. We're going to use the 10mm ones on the top plate. And I'm just going to put a couple in just to hold it together for now. I'm not going to tighten these up particularly, I'm just putting 2 screws in for the sake of just holding the plate in position. Alright. There we go, that'll do. Alright, and show you why you need the longer screws on the top plate. See, there is a gap in the block. The blocks don't actually completely seal up because they're clamping the boom. Even the pivot block has a gap in it because it's clamping onto the bearing, the outer case of the bearing. Right? By the way, you can see how smoothly that's spinning. That's because I got that inner clearance on the gimbal right. Okay. And so there's this gap. And in fact, if you look at these spare pins we popped in, turn it around, the spare pins we popped in to fill those gaps, I said that they're handy because they do add a bit of bite. If you look there, it's a bit hard to see. There is actually a gap of a couple of mil between the end of the pin and the plate, because the pins touch the bottom plate, they don't actually touch the top plate inside the boom mounts. And that's why you need to use the longer screw, because you've got to make up that gap where it sits inside that block where you can't see it. So that's why we use the 10mm. You can even use, if you're stuck, the 14mm screws on the top plate to do all these screws up. Alright, so what you want to do is go around. Don't tighten the boom ones up just yet, because later on you're going to want to set, per the manual, the angles on your motors. Alright, different models have different angles. Right, so you want to check your instructions for the angles you need to set on these. Right, but don't tighten these screws up here on those booms until you've done those angles. Alright, you can, however, fully tighten the ones up on any pivot mounts. Alright, now see there what was happening was that screw was catching. Of course it's starting to cross thread, and what it'll be is this plate isn't quite in the right spot. So if you loosen the other screws off, you'll be able to just manoeuvre the pin a bit. See how much movement is there? Be able to get that pin better lined up, and that screw will ease in quite nicely now. There we go, all the way in. Now the reason people get into trouble with these screws and strip the heads and stuff out is that they keep cross-threading them. So if when you're putting it in, it starts feeling like it's binding up, it probably is because there's an angle, there's a cross thread happening. So back the screw out and work out why it's cross threaded before you strip the head out of the screw. Very important tip, that one. So, not going to do it now, but you can basically, at this point in time, you can do all those screws. Now, when you get to these gaps, what I do is I do actually tighten them up, and I do actually take out that gap in the pins, right? And because I've now squeezed that center section there, this whole frame has just become that much more rigid and stable because of that flex we've put into the two plates. And it just makes the whole airframe that much stiffer because we've bound up those gaps with these fill-in pins, if you like, have taken up. Alright, so that's our center section. We're ready to add the rest of the flight control stuff too. Now, one thing I've skipped here is I haven't put the nylon standoffs on the screws in this center section. I should have done that before I put the plate on, but most of the new plates now actually have metal inserts, metal studs, threaded studs in the plates, so you don't have to worry about putting the nylon standoff for your flight control board, your Paris board, in before you put your top plate on. With the older plates, you have to put those nylon standoffs on before you put the plate in. With the removable center plates, which are now coming with most kits and are available as an option, it just makes this whole thing so much simpler. Because with the removable center, I've now got a dirty big hole in the middle there, and I can actually screw this plate on the outer ring and tidy up my wiring and make sure everything is where it should be before that gap gets held up. And I can do things like change motor directions and that sort of stuff without having to disassemble this whole section. I can just have that centerpiece out, and it just makes the whole build of the Scarab so much easier. Alright, so that's all I'm going to do as far as the build videos are for now. Later on I'll come back and do the some mounting of the Paris and stuff like that. But pretty much, if you can get to this stage, that is the build done. From here, we just need to make sure the Paris is working properly. We need to site our receiver somewhere, which is not that big a deal, and start the electronic setup, which I've covered in other videos.